There's a chair at the front. Come, I can see you. Come closer. Get comfortable. First of all, I'd like to express a huge thanks to Keith and Lauren for hosting this evening. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Ereira Senior and David. It's a big honor to have you here with us this evening. And of course, Marcus, Joshua, Eliana, and Sharon. Still, there's no words. But as Rabbi Fima said, the only thing we can do in these terrible situations is come together, which is what we have done over the last 30 days, is we've tried to surround you with love and with learning, and as Rabbi Fima said, it is really an inspiration to see the bravery and the manner in which the boys are in shul every morning so early before me. I walk in, I see them already up there, they're already davening very early. I know Rabbi Fima starts about 20 minutes before St. John's Wood, so it's a tougher gig, but it's really very humbling and it's very, very special. I want to begin with a story, and someone said to me, where do you get all these stories from? Do you make them up? Do you hear them? This story I heard from a rabbi called Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, who heard the story from another rabbi called Rabbi Y.Y. Schechter, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University in New York. And he heard this story directly from the person involved, a man by the name of Pirkei Avot. And I need to share this story with you because I think this story summarizes why we are here. This story also connects us with the 3 weeks. As Rabbi Fima mentioned, we've just started a period in Jewish history called the 3 weeks, the Ben HaMetzarim, the period between Shiva Osa B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, which was a fast day yesterday, all the way to Tisha B'Av, where we recall all the tragedies of our people, of everything that befell our people over the last 2,000 years. Now, Pirkei Avot is a man who has the most fascinating job. What he does is he goes around from high school to high school in Israel to prepare the Israeli teenagers for the army. In our country, your average 17, 18-year-old is partying hard, getting ready for university, arguing with their parents about curfew times and cars, and which car they want to have. In Israel it's different. They're doing all of the above, but they're also preparing for compulsory conscription to the Israeli army. And it's humbling to see these young boys and girls going off into the army. But what Pirkei Avot does is he prepares them. And he does a series of classes explaining to them the importance of what they're about to do, explaining to them the beauty of Israel, the history of Israel, the identity of what it's going to give them, the cause that they're fighting for. He takes them to Yad Vashem, he talks to them about the Holocaust, and why Israel was such an important place. As Lord Sachs often says, the place we call home, the place where you go where you have nowhere else to go. We all feel very connected to Israel. And in their final session, the climax of this preparation, he takes them to Har Herzl. Mount Herzl is the beautiful place on the outskirts of Jerusalem, the mountain where the prime ministers of Israel are buried. But not only the prime ministers of Israel, but also all the fallen soldiers of Israel. And as you walk around Har Herzl, you see different sections. You have the sections for all the soldiers who were killed in the Battle of Independence in 1948. And then you have the section for all the soldiers that were killed in 1956 in the Sinai campaign. And then the 67 war, the 73 war, the Yom Kippur war, the 82 war, and so on and so forth. And he takes these soldiers around to visit these graves, to show them the sacrifice of our country, to show them what they are fighting for, to show them that their service is not in vain, and it's the only country in the world, the only Jewish state, the importance of it. And on one such visit, he goes to the section of 1948, the War of Independence, and there are 70 graves. And he tells the boys and girls the stories of these 70 graves. These were 17 Israeli soldiers who all died on the same day in a terrible battle on the date of the independence in 1948. And this entire unit was wiped out. And they're walking along and they're reading the gravestones. And there's one grave that it says on it the date of where the person died, his serial number, some information, but then it just says Almoni. Almoni means the anonymous one. And they ask him, Aryeh, what does it mean, the anonymous one? Why doesn't he have a name on the gravestone? And he said, I'll tell you the story of this grave. This grave is the grave of somebody who died anonymously. What do I mean? He was a Holocaust survivor. He came over on the boats after the displaced persons camps in 1947, and as he arrived in Israel and Haifa, he was handed a gun and he was taken to the army, and he fought. And the double tragedy, he was the only surviving member of his family. His entire family had been wiped out in the Holocaust. And he gets to Haifa, and he joins the army, and a few months later, in the War of Independence, he dies for Israel. Having survived the hell of Birkenau and Auschwitz, he then dies in Israel. And on that day, all his friends and all his comrades die with him. And no one knows his name. So there's no name to put on the gravestone. There's no one to ask. There's no relatives. And they said, but who says Kaddish for him? There's no one to say Kaddish for him. And who visits him on his yacht side? There's no one. The boys and girls are overcome with emotion. And off they go. A year later to the day, Aryeh Eldad gets a phone call. It wasn't to the day, it was a year later approximately, around that time. He gets a phone call from one of these boys who he had taught a year earlier, who was now in the army, very excited. And he said, Aryeh, you've got to meet us tomorrow at Har Herzl. He said, why? He said, we found the family of Almoni. What do you mean you found the family? This is a prank? What are you saying? We found the family. He said, this was 70 years ago. There's no surviving relatives. Meet us tomorrow at 12 o'clock. We're going to Har Herzl. It's his yacht site. We're going to go there and pray. He goes along and he sees this entire group of Israeli soldiers. And they turn to him and they say to him, we are his family. We will come here every year and we will say Kaddish for this person. Very powerful story, which I think summarizes two things. First of all, the message of the 3 weeks. The idea that the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred Jew between Jew. We were unable to get along, and therefore we have this period called the 3 weeks. But it also summarizes the feelings we have here this evening. I think it's clear to see Russell was a unifier. He brings people together. Never in my time in St. John's Wood, and I'm sure Keith can vouch for many more years before I arrived, has so many people come on a Monday night to hear some Torah. But Russell is a unifier, and he brings us together. And in that context, I want to try and learn with you a few Mishnayot this evening. I realize it's already late. We're not going to go on the full time, but we're going to try and learn together several Mishnayot in memory of Russell. And we're going to try and understand some of the Mefarshim, and we're also going to do a little bit of Jewish history as well. So on the first page, finishing off from last week, we didn't quite get to finish. I'd like to ask for a volunteer to read Mishnah 7. Can we have a volunteer? Gideon, because you've got a loud voice and you're in the front row. Mishnah 7.
In English, I'm hoping.
In English, granted. No trouble.
Sure.
Go for it. Front page, Mishnah 7, yeah?
He used to say, the more flesh, the more worms. The more property, the more anxiety. The more wives, the more witchcraft. The more female slaves, the more lewdness. The more slaves, the more robbery. But the more Torah, the more life. The more sitting in the company of scholars, the more wisdom. The more counsel, the more understanding. The more charity, the more peace. If one acquires a good name, he has acquired something for himself. If one acquires for himself knowledge of Torah, he has acquired life in the world to come.
A very powerful Mishnah, and a very mysterious Mishnah. You read some of the English, you think, what on earth is this talking about? And it needs a bit of explanation, it needs a little bit of commentary. But I just want to share with you a couple of ideas about the Mishnah. Our Mishnah is spelling out to us the danger of overindulgence. It also brings into a sharp reality the consequence of excess. And Judaism is actually a religion that believes in moderation. We don't believe in extremes. Maimonides talks about the middle path. Thank you so much. Maimonides talks about the middle path, not taking extremes. And there are many cliches. We talk bigger is better. We live in a supersized world. You go to America and you order a hamburger. Would you like me to supersize that? We live in a culture where people like everything instantly, and they like it big, great, as much as possible. But that's not the Jewish way. The Mishnah talks of this idea of stressing the value of living a simple life. stressing the middle path, stressing simplicity, not being complicated, and taking pleasure in the simple things. You don't always need to do the best, be the best, just sometimes enjoying the simple pleasures of life. I remember I used to go out with JFS with a group of students on a regular basis to Gateshead. Now Gateshead is an ultra-Orthodox community where they live in an incredibly frugal manner. And I remember spending Shabbat with a family where they had 8 children, and they had 4 bedrooms. And they had guests staying in their house. And I just couldn't fathom, from the world that I came from, of comfortable North London, how this works. But I've never in my life met happier children, more stable children, more loved children, because their parents taught them about the simple things. And the look on this 12-year-old boy when it was his birthday on the Sunday and his father presented him with a football. And I thought, what I would only do if my father dared give me a football for my 12th birthday. But this simpleness, the simplicity of life, and really the Mishnah is saying how beautiful that is. There's also some beautiful wisdom in that a human being is made of 3 things. We're made of a nefesh, our animalistic soul, so to speak, our sense of seeking pleasure and survival, food, shelter, safety, warmth, etc., etc. We're then made of ruach. Ruach is spirit. And that's really the energy that kind of propels us to seek success. Whether that means dedicating ourselves to a cause, searching for a cure to cancer, being involved in charity work, that's like the nefesh, the energy, the ruach, the energy within us. And then you have neshama. And the neshama is the soul, the spark of the divine within each and every one of us, which really, the neshama channels the ruach and the nefesh. And in order to be fulfilled psychologically, emotionally, and physically, of course you need to have nefesh. You need to have your physical needs met. You need to have ruach, but it needs to be for a higher purpose. And the Mishnah is reminding us this in the most crude of ways. The more flesh, the more worms. This idea of really connecting. Are you living to work, or are you working to live? Do you spend your day in the office just to have a larger bank balance? Or are you doing it because you want to be involved with philanthropy and with good causes, or with supporting your family? You know, on a person's deathbed, they never turn around and say, I wish I would have spent more time in the office. You know, it's such a shame. When am I going to have that opportunity again? You think about family, you think about values, you think about Judaism perhaps, you think about what life is really about. The Gemara says, if somebody earns 100, they immediately desire 200. It's human nature. There was actually a study done of people who were asked what would be their ideal annual income. And they did a study. The guy who was earning 30,000 a year said he wants 60,000 a year. The guy earning 60,000 a year wanted 120. The guy earning 100 wanted 200, etc., etc. And this is a Gemara. The Talmud says the same thing. You give somebody 100, they say, I want 200. It's human nature. But it's important, the Mishnah is reminding us, not to always chase the profit, but to really think about the value of life, the purpose of luxury, and to make sure that is a focus. Moving on to Mishnah number 8. Can I ask for another volunteer? Max, you haven't got a sheet, do you? So there you go. Go on, Max. Mishnah 8, loud and clear. And I'm going to ask you just to do the first part of the Mishnah.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received the old tradition from Hillel and Shammai. He used to say, if you have learned much Torah, do not claim credit for yourself, because for such a purpose were you created.
Pause there. Amazing statement. Don't take credit for learning Torah, right? Don't go home, pat yourself on your back. I went to a shiur. Big deal. Yochanan ben Zakkai says the following. Just like you don't praise yourself when you eat or drink, don't praise yourself when you learn Torah, because that's what you were created for. This is the essence of life. I want to share with you a little bit of history. Who was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Because actually learning the context of who he was and how great he was makes you appreciate this Mishnah so much more. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai served as the leader of the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, and he was quite a remarkable person. He lived at a time of the destruction of the temple, and during his days there was lots of influences as well from Greece, from Rome. Society was kind of in trouble, and there was a huge amount of sinat chinam, baseless hatred, the hatred that brought us to the destruction of the temple. And he lived at a time when the Romans began to siege Jerusalem. And in the year 66, there were 3 very wealthy men. One of them was Kalba Savua. Does anyone remember who Kalba Savua was? Kalba Savua was the father-in-law of Rabbi Akiva. He was the wealthiest man of the generation, and he, together with two other wealthy people, they had enough storehouses of grain, of oil, of food to keep the people going for 21 years. They could have kept off the Roman siege for 21 years. But along come a group of people called the Baryanim, the Zealots, and they burned down all the storehouses. Imagine, they're in tremendous danger from the Romans, and these group of people burned down all the storehouses for 21 years. Why did they do that? They wanted to basically show that the Almighty was in charge, He would supply divine aid, and they burned the supplies, and there was tremendous civil war, so to speak. And they even set up, they wouldn't allow anyone in or out of Jerusalem unless, of course, it was a coffin being taken out to be buried. And one day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai realizes as the leader he's got to do something, and he needs to get out of the city, and he needs to speak to the Romans. But the problem is, no one's allowed in or out unless it's a corpse. So what does he do? He tells his Talmidim, his students, cover me in burial shrouds, put me in a coffin, and carry me out. And that way he's smuggled out of Jerusalem. And he comes out, and he gets to the outside, and he meets Vespasian, who is the Roman general in charge. And he sees him, and he says, "Hail the emperor." And Vespasian gets very angry. He says, "Why are you calling me the emperor? I'm not Caesar. Why are you calling me that?" He was so furious with him, he threatens to have him executed. And just at the nick of time, several messengers arrive from Rome to say that Caesar has died and Vespasian has been appointed the emperor. And Vespasian is so impressed how he knew this. He said, "How did you know this?" And he says, "It's a posuk in Yeshaya. In Isaiah, the posuk tells us that when the temple will be destroyed, it will be done by a king. So you must be the emperor." And Vespasian says, "I'm so enamored by your greatness, I will grant you 3 wishes. Any wishes you want, I will grant them for you." So what would you choose? You're the leader of the Jewish people, the grain's been destroyed, everyone's in trouble. What would you choose? It's pretty obvious. You choose for the Jerusalem to be saved, right? But he doesn't choose that. We have a concept in Judaism, tafasta merubah lo tafasta. You try to get too much, you're not going to get anything. And he realizes that's going to be out of his grasp. So what does he ask for instead? He asks for 3 things. Tell li Yavne v'chachmeha. Give me Yavne and its sages. Yavne was a town in the middle of nowhere. He said, let me have that town and let me go and live there with the sages and live a quiet life. That was number 1. Number 2, he requests for a special protection for the family of Rabbi Gamliel. And number 3, he asks for a doctor for Rabbi Tzadok, a very old ailing Jew who was one of the spiritual leaders of the time. Why did he ask for those 3 things? It was in his infinite wisdom he realized that these 3 things are going to save the Jewish people. Because he knew for there to be a Jewish future, there's got to be education. They're going to destroy the temple either way. We're going to be exiled. But if we go and set up shop and start a Bet Midrash, a learning place, a place of learning somewhere else, there's hope for a Jewish future. So they go and set up in Yavne. And that becomes the greatest center of learning to this day. There's a yeshiva in Yavne. My 2 brothers learn in Keren B'Yavne. It's the most beautiful, magnificent yeshiva. For hundreds and hundreds of years, it's been a place of learning. It's been a very special place. Why does he ask protection for the house of Rabbi Gamliel? Rabbi Gamliel was a descendant of King David. And he knew that ultimately the Messiah and the Messianic future leader of the Jewish people will come from that family. If that family are protected, we have a hope of the Mashiach to be protected. And lastly, Rabbi Tzadok, because he realizes Rabbi Tzadok is the spiritual luminary of the generation. If he dies right now, people will be so disheartened and so downtrodden, there'd be no hope for the future. And there, you read the Mishnah again, and you see the wisdom of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If you've studied Torah, do not take credit for yourself, because that is what you were created for. So that is the second Mishnah that I wanted to share some insights with you tonight. Moving on, if I can ask volunteer to read the next Mishnah. Any volunteers with a loud voice?
David, right next to you.
David? Okay. In fact, yeah, go for it.
Number 10. They said 3 things, Rabbi Eliezer said. Let the honor of your friend be as dear to you as your own, and be not easily provoked to anger, and repent one day before your death.
Okay, pause there. So 3 things. He asks for 3 things. He tells them 3 things over here. Number 1, let the honor of your friend be dear to you as your own honor. There's a concept in Judaism. You don't just worry about yourself, you worry about other people. And the Mishnah is teaching us this important idea of caring for the honor of others. The beautiful story of Rabbi 11 when he went to the doctor with his wife, and his wife's arm was in a lot of pain, and he turns to the doctor and he said, "Our arm is hurting." And the doctor said, "Whose arm?" He said, "Our arm." Because he lived with that spirit. And that's true unity. If you burn your hand, if your left hand knocks your right hand into a fire and you burn it, you don't punish your other hand for burning the other hand because it's part of the same body. Living life with an idea that you really are part of something greater is the theme the Mishnah wants to get across. This idea, let the honor of your friend be as dear as your own honor. And I think that's really, in the period of the 3 weeks, an important idea to be remembered. Do not be easily provoked to anger. Some people have a short fuse. They get angry easily. The Mishnah is telling us, try to be calm and not get angry. And repent 1 day before the day of your death. What's the problem with that? No one knows when the day of their death is going to be upon them. The Mishnah is teaching us, in other words, every single day of your life you need to be doing teshuvah. Every single day of your life you need to repent. Which is why, by the way, 3 times a day when we say the Amidah, we say, Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, I'm sorry God, I've sinned. We say it before we go to bed, we say Shema. We apologize for everything we've done that day wrong. There's a Jewish idea, before you go to sleep, you should just reflect, what did I do well this day, what did I do not so well today? How is tomorrow going to be a better day than today? And that's the idea also of Shabbat. You have a review of the whole previous week. You know, the Hasidim have a custom on Friday night, they eat a food called farfel. Because it's a pun on the words, because of farfel. The whole week has gone by. What did I achieve this past week? In Judaism, we're constantly trying to introspect, to review. How am I going to become greater? How's tomorrow going to be better than today? It's an even interesting thing. On Motzei Yom Kippur, you've just spent 25 hours in shul praying. You've been saying sorry all day long. We say Mariv, and you immediately say sorry again. Surely you could have a few minutes where you're exempt. But no, this is the idea that we don't think that we are perfect. We recognize we have faults. And I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about teshuvah. Rabbi Fima spoke about the idea of trying to self-improve. But there are 2 types of teshuvah. There's repentance between you and God, things that you haven't done right, that are between you and God strictly, an observance or whatever it may be. And there are other types of teshuvah between man and his fellow man. And that type of teshuvah is very, very personal. If you have wronged another person, you have to ask them for forgiveness. There's an incredible story told about Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Holocaust catcher, the Nazi catcher. He caught many, many hundreds of Nazis. He was responsible for incredible works. He dedicated his life, the rest of his life after the Holocaust, to help capture Nazis. And he tells this story in his book called The Sunflower, which I really highly recommend. He tells a story where he recounts his experience, how at the end of the Holocaust, he meets a terminally ill Nazi. He's in Lemberg concentration camp, and he's in the hospital there, and he's completely in ill health himself. And the nurse takes him into a room where there is a Nazi on his deathbed. This Nazi looks at him. The Nazi is clearly dying. And the Nazi describes how 3 years earlier he was involved in the most terrible atrocity. They went to a small town, and they took all the Jews of that town into a building, and they locked them in the building. Parents, children, young children, crammed hundreds and hundreds of Jews into this building, with Nazis outside with machine guns if anyone dared try to escape, and they set the building alight. And he described how he was responsible for that atrocity. And as he's lying there on his deathbed, he turns to Wiesenthal and he says, I want to ask you for forgiveness. Simon Wiesenthal, young boy, just stands there frozen. What does he say? Should he forgive? Should he not forgive? He stands there completely frozen and silent, and he goes out of the room, and the next day he hears that the Nazi has died. And it bothers him. Did he do the right thing? Should he have given him forgiveness? Should he not have done? And after the Holocaust, he writes to all the world's religious leaders, from the Dalai Lama to the Pope to the chief rabbis, asking what would have been the right thing to do and what was the wrong thing to do. And he hears loads of different answers. But Rabbi Yisrael Me'elau, the chief rabbi of Israel, gives the Jewish answer, which is you can only forgive those who've done wrong to you. That Nazi can't ask you for forgiveness. He's got to go and ask those victims for forgiveness. You can't ask somebody, if I punch you in the face, I can't then go say sorry to you. That doesn't make sense. That's counterintuitive. There's also a story told of the Briskerov, the great rabbi of Brisk. Did I tell the story last time? No, just want to make sure I'm not repeating myself. I sometimes do that in the classroom, and the kids, they call me out on it, but adults are too polite, so please do call me out if I repeat anything. The story is told of the great rabbi of Brisk. He was on a train, and there are a few Jews playing cards, and he's sitting learning Talmud like great rabbis do, and he's sitting studying, and they say, "Rabbi, come and play cards with us." And he very politely declines, "Thank you, I'm learning." And one of these men get really angry. "Rabbi, I told you, come and play cards with us." And he refuses. He says, "If you don't come and play cards with us, I'm going to throw you off this carriage." And then he picks up the Briskerov, and he throws him between the carriages. In the freezing cold winter of Brisk, he makes him stand between the carriages for over an hour till they arrive at Brisk. They arrive at the train station of Brisk, and there's a huge amount of people waiting to greet the great rabbi of Brisk. And this man realizes there's a big fanfare. He asks, "Who are they waiting for?" "We're waiting for the great rabbi of Brisk." And then he sees this man who he's pushed off the carriage come off the train a bit shaky. And he realizes what he's done, and he runs after him. "Rabbi, forgive me, I've done something terrible." And the Briskerov ignores him. The next day he goes to his house, begs him for forgiveness. He doesn't want to know him. A few days this man can't eat or sleep. He feels terrible. He finds the Briskerov's son. He says, "Your father won't forgive me. What do I do?" And he tells him the whole story. And the son's a little bit surprised. His father's a forgiving person. He goes in with him to the Briskerov. And the Briskerov explains, "I can't give him forgiveness because he didn't mean to upset me. He upset a simple Jew on the train. Had he known I was the Briskerov, he would have never dared speak to me that way." This is the Jewish concept of forgiveness. You need to forgive the person who you've affected, and that's really, really important. And I'll conclude. How are we doing for time? A few more minutes?
9.
Yeah? We'll do one more Mishnah. I've got another great story that I have to tell you. So if I could just ask you to finish reading this Mishnah. Finish reading the rest of the Mishnah. Warm yourself, yeah.
Warm yourself before the fire of the wise, but beware of being singed by their glowing coals, for their bite is the bite of a fox, and their sting is the sting of a scorpion, and their hiss is the hiss of a serpent, and all their words are like coals of fire.
Okay, a very strange Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us you should warm yourself by the fire of the Chachamim. You should surround yourself with wise, great people. You should learn Torah, obviously. But be aware that if you get too close, you can be singed by their coals. Or they're bit by the fox. A bite of a fox, particularly ferocious, apparently. I'm not a vet, but I just did look it up. Apparently a fox bite is supposed to be particularly ferocious. What does this mean? So there's a couple of points here. First of all, there is a mitzvah in the Torah to honor sages. And it's the reason why it's a mitzvah is because ultimately one of our roles in this world is to connect with God. But it's very hard to connect with God. What do? You want to connect, become spiritual. How do you do that? Obviously by keeping mitzvot, that will help you. But by learning Torah, and the way in which we learn Torah is through the sages, and by connecting with Rabbanim, with sages, it allows a closeness with God. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about the Masorah, the chain of tradition, and having that link in the chain and how important it is. But there shouldn't be familiarity. There is a danger. You need to honor Rabbanim, but when you cross certain lines, it can become dangerous. I remember this crazy story. It happened when I was in the sixth form. I went with a group of friends away for a Shabbat. We had a school Shabbaton. We went off to a campsite. We had an amazing weekend together. And it happened to be in one of the rooms, there was a picture of a saintly rabbi, a contemporary rabbi living in Jerusalem who'd probably died in the last 20 years. And one of my friends, as a laugh, he took a cigarette and he stuck it with a bit of blue tack to this rabbi's mouth. It was quite funny, I must say. We were all laughing and having a bit of a laugh. And this story is a little bit mystical, but they say if you believe every story, you're silly. But if you don't believe any stories, you're even more silly, right? Take from this story what you want. Within a very short space of time, terrible things started happening to my friend. he had car crashes, started failing exams, was having all sorts of problems with his family. Things weren't going well, and he was really a high-flying, straight-A kind of guy. Everything had always gone smoothly. And he went to see a Kabbalist. And this Kabbalist, this Makubal, said to him, "Have you offended any great Rav?" And he's thinking, and suddenly he has a vision of the cigarette on the picture of the rabbi. And he says, "Well, it's a bit embarrassing, but now you mention it, there was this incident with the cigarette with a picture. Who was the rabbi?" So he finds out who the rabbi was. And I'm being careful not to say the name of the rabbi out of not to be disrespectful to him. And the Kabbalist says to him, "I want you to go with a minyan to the grave of this Kabbalist, of this rabbi. He's no longer alive, and I want you to beg him for forgiveness." And I was part of the minyan. 10 of us, we went to Har HaMenuchot in Yerushalayim. We prayed at this rabbi's grave. And let me tell you, this boy today, he's in his mid-30s, doing fantastically. He's got a lovely family, and he's very successful. But this incident, just always I think of this, when we talk about this Mishnah, the sting of a scorpion, the hiss of a serpent, being careful to show the correct respect is so, so important. Just to conclude, we've finished pretty much the second perek. We'll do one more Mishnah, which says, Mishnah 12, I'll read it. Rabbi Yossi says, "Let the property of your fellow be precious to you as your own. Make yourself fit for Torah study, for it will not be your inheritance, and let all your actions be for the sake of heaven." This Mishnah has a lot of beauty to it. But first of all, the importance of taking care of other people's possessions. The Mishnah tells us this mitzvah of Hashavat HaVeidah in the Torah to look after other people's possessions. There was an amazing story recently on the BBC website of an elderly couple in Argentina, which is not known for tremendous honesty, this area that he was in. And there was a huge sack of money that they had with them. This elderly couple, was there a big amount of money they had, and they left it in the taxi. It's over $30,000. And this elderly couple, they realized what's happened. Several days later, the taxi driver came back with all the money. And they were amazed. And it made the BBC News. Why this made the BBC News is perhaps a testament to the society that we live in. But they set up a website to honor this taxi driver, to thank him for his good deeds. But the Mishnah is telling us we need to take care of other people's possessions as if it's your own. And finally, the Mishnah says, let your actions be for the sake of heaven. There's a Gemara in Nozir that says that a person should always occupy himself in Torah mitzvot for the sake of heaven. But even when it's not for the sake of heaven, it's still okay. Why? Because things that you do for the wrong reasons, eventually you'll come and do them for the right reasons. And that's why Parshat Balak, why did Balak deserve to have a Seder in the Torah named after him? He was a wicked king who wanted to curse the Jewish people. But he still brought offerings to God. He brought 42 offerings to Hashem to try and help him curse the Jewish people. So that one action was still considered great enough. He has a Parsha in the Torah named after him. So I think really the message is, we've talked a lot tonight about various ideas in these Mishnayot. And in Judaism, sometimes we try and do things that we understand fully what we do, but even if we do good things with perhaps the wrong motivation or the wrong understanding, they should still stand us in good stead. Thank you very much for coming. This is the last session we're having on this side of the summer. There will be a session in Israel, the end of August, for those people in Israel, and then the next one will be on the 9th of September at Gary and Fiona Phillips. Rabbi Chanana ben Kasha Omer Rosa Kodesh Baruch Hu Nizakos Es Yisrael Lefika Hebon Lahem Torah Mitzvahs Shne'emar Adonai Chavetz L'Matzidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadeh. Kaddish.
ישראל, ועל תמידהון ועל כל תמידי תמידהון, דסקין בו איתה קדישתה, די ואתה חדן, ודי בכל אתה ואתה, והי לנו אהול אהון, הנה והסתה ורמד, מי קודם מרא שמיה, קרא ואמרו אמן, ושמלה שמיה, חיים בסבא, בשועה, בנחמה, בשבה ופרועה ובגולה, וסלחה, בחפרה ורבע, והצלה, לנו כל עמו ישראל, אמן. עשה שלום ומעבו ורחמה, ועשה שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל, ואמרו אמן.